Okay, so what connects a single giant red rock in the Australian desert? An ancient fortress built on top of a granite tower in Sri Lanka, a 350-ton broken stone in France, and the solar alignment of Stonehenge.
Well, the one thing that connects all of them at a really fundamental level is monumental stone.
Right.
Whether it's a single piece that was sculpted by geology or a structure that was assembled by human hands, these sources are all about the sheer scale of stone.
Exactly, and that's what we're doing today. We've compiled a whole stack of sources for this deep dive into giant stone structures. Our mission is to, cut through some of the noise and distinguish between what's natural, what's man-made, and really help you understand the surprising things that modern science is revealing about them.
And these sources are dense. I mean, they range from geological rankings all the way to, academic critiques of construction theories.
Right.
But I think if we navigate it right, you'll walk away with a pretty good shortcut to being well-informed.
Okay, let's unpack this. And maybe we should start by setting some ground rules for what we're even talking about. Because I think when most people hear massive stone structure, they use one word for it. And often, that word is wrong.
That's so true.
We need to start with the difference between two terms that get confused all the time: monolith and megalith.
The difference is simple, but it's absolutely critical. So a monolith, it literally means one stone, is a mountain or a boulder or a tower that's made of a single continuous piece of rock.
So if nature makes a giant mountain out of one rock, that's a natural monolith. But humans can make them too, right? The sources were clear on that.
Correct. If you carve a structure, say out of a single piece of bedrock, you've got a carved monolithic structure. Think of the Kailasa temple in India.
Incredible.
Yeah, it was carved top down from one rock, or, the unfinished Egyptian obelisk. The whole thing is still one continuous, unbroken piece of stone.
Okay, so that's one stone. What's the other side of the coin? The megalith.
A megalith, sometimes you'll see it called a polylith, means many stones. It's a structure made of more than one very large rock block. And those huge blocks are then assembled, usually without any mortar. It's what we call dry stone construction.
So Stonehenge, with all its different pieces locked together, that's a megalith.
Exactly.
And the sources point out this classic trip-up point. The Moai statues on Easter Island, we always hear them called monoliths.
That is the classic confusion. The Moai statues themselves are carved from single stones, yes, but they stand on these platforms called amu.
Okay.
And those platforms are built from multiple blocks all assembled together. So the whole monument, entire complex, is defined as a megalithic structure.
So the key is assembly. If you assemble it, it's a megalith. If it's one big piece, it's a monolith.
You got it.
All right, with that sorted, let's start with nature's own architecture. The largest natural monoliths. I think we should focus on a few key examples, not just, list off a bunch of facts.
Absolutely. And there isn't a single official geological ranking. It's just too hard to measure how deep these things go. But a few examples really do stand out globally.
And at the top of that list, with very little doubt, you have Uluru in the Australian desert.
Uluru is it's a geological wonder. It's a massive sandstone monolith, stands over 1,000 feet tall. It's more than 2 miles long. I mean, geologically, it's not just a mountain sitting on the surface.
Right.
The sources say it's the eroded tip of a huge rock slab that actually goes miles down vertically into the earth. It gives you a sense of just how much rock we're talking about.
It's a scale you just can't get from photos.
Yeah.
Now, let's contrast that ancient sandstone Leviathan with something that looks almost engineered, like Devil's Tower in Wyoming.
Devil's Tower is fascinating. Its formation is so distinct, it rises almost 900 feet, but what defines it are those tight, almost perfect hexagonal columns.
Yeah.
They formed when ancient lava cooled really fast, and it created this kind of petrified honeycomb structure.
And the cultural story is just as compelling. It was the very first U.S. national monument way back in 1906, and Native American histories say those grooves are the claw marks of a giant bear.
Exactly. It's a perfect example of how a unique monolith immediately gets woven into a culture's identity. Or you could look at El Capitan in Yosemite. It's famous not so much for its geology, but for its sheer, uncompromising height, 3,600 feet straight up from the valley floor. And it's become this global epicenter for rock climbing.
Right, where people spend weeks just suspended on its face.
It's a totally different kind of cultural monument, one that's defined by human endurance.
And one more, where humanity saw a giant stone and decided to turn it into a palace. Sigiriya in Sri Lanka.
Sigiriya is a 660-foot granite monolith, but what's amazing is the 5th century fortress and palace they built right on its flattened summit. Frescoes, gardens, everything.
Wow.
It wasn't just for defense, it was the symbol of absolute power, using the scale of the rock for their own monumental architecture.
It's incredible what nature can build and what people can build on it. But now let's make that pivot. From natural wonders to the immense human effort of building with multiple giant stones, megalithic structures.
And the sources define this as the longest-lasting and most widespread building culture in human history, all characterized by that dry stone construction, using blocks that sometimes weigh hundreds of tons.
And these break down into three main types. Let's start with the simplest one, the menhir.
The menhir is, simply, a single upright long stone. They can stand all by themselves, or they can be grouped in these incredible rows like the ones you see at Karnak in France.
And speaking of Karnak, the sources mention one of the broken menhirs there. The largest one weighed an insane 350 tons. And it was over 20 meters long. I mean, just imagine moving something heavier than 4 fully loaded semi-trucks.
Then you've got the dolmen. That's typically a single-chamber tomb, often built with what's called a trilithon design. 2 upright stones with a single capstone on top. These are the most common ones we find.
And finally, the cromlech, or stone circle.
Right, the complex arrangement of menhirs or dolmens in a geometric shape. And of course, Stonehenge is the most famous example of that.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because once these megaliths were identified across Europe, this huge academic fight just erupted over where they came from.
Oh yeah, for decades you had 2 fiercely competing theories.
The traditional view from the 19th and 20th centuries was the diffusion theory.
Right, the idea that the concept spread from a single place like the Near East, maybe carried by sea traders or some kind of priestly elite.
But then in the 1970s, new carbon-14 dating methods led to this other idea, the nativeness or independent origin theory.
Exactly. Archaeologists suddenly realized that some European sites, especially in Brittany and Portugal, were actually dating earlier than the supposed source points in the Near East.
Wait, so for decades, the accepted timeline was completely upside down.
It absolutely was. It basically turned the whole established chronology on its head. It suggested these traditions just popped up independently all over Western Europe.
That must have been a revolution in the field.
It was. However, the most recent research has added another twist. It used Bayesian probability analysis on data from over 2,400 megalithic sites.
And what did that massive data analysis show?
It suggested that the oldest megalithic graves were actually clustered in northwest France, dating from about 4,700 to 4,000 BC. And crucially, the spread from there was rapid, and it followed the Atlantic and Mediterranean coasts.
So it's spread by sea.
It strongly suggests that advanced maritime mobility was the key to this culture's expansion, which, challenges the idea of purely isolated native development.
So the high-tech analysis is now refining the 70s theory, suggesting an incredible level of navigational skill for Neolithic societies.
It does, but if you zoom all the way out, the sources remind us that the concept of using huge stones started much, much earlier.
At Göbekli Tepe.
At Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, yeah, back around 9600 BC. So the core idea may have started in the Fertile Crescent, but this specific European tradition seems to have taken hold in France and then spread like wildfire along the coasts.
Which sets the stage perfectly for the most famous megalithic structure of all, Stonehenge. Now, for decades, public perception was all about those theories from the 60s and 70s, that it was some kind of precise astronomical computer for predicting eclipses.
And the sources are very clear that modern reassessments have pretty much debunked that idea. There just isn't convincing evidence that it was designed for a great many precise alignments that we can measure with modern tools. The focus has fundamentally shifted.
Okay, so if they weren't building an observatory, what were they doing? How does the modern view look at it?
The focus shifts from modern analytical astronomy to prehistoric perception, what some call cosmovision.
Cosmovision, yeah.
Yeah. Basically, that knowledgeable people in all ancient cultures integrated the sky, the sun, the moon, the stars into their politics, their religion, their worldview. The structures reflect that sacred geography, not necessarily a desire for mathematical precision.
And you see that really clearly when you look at the different phases of the monument. In the early phases, the ditch, the bank, there were some hints of lunar orientation. The entrance axis is close to the northern lunar limit, but the evidence is it's a bit tenuous.
The real undeniable clarity comes in phase 3, when they put up the massive Sarsen circle. The evidence for solar solstitial orientation is just clear-cut.
A huge shift in focus.
A huge shift. The main axis aligns precisely with the summer and winter solstices. It marks this crucial transition in their ritual focus over to solar symbolism.
And it wasn't just a general alignment. The Sarsen circle and the horseshoe shape were built right on this axis. It created what the sources call a solar corridor.
Right.
So the midsummer sunrise would shine down a thin tunnel of stone right into the inner sanctum.
And that is the key insight for you, the listener. It suggests a highly exclusive spectacle. The earlier lunar observations might have been public, but this solar event was focused on the interior.
So it was a ritual for a very select, limited few.
Exactly. Suggesting the monument's function was tied up in hierarchy and ritual power.
Which brings us to the question that always comes up. The how. How on earth did Neolithic people move 80 sarsen stones, some weighing hundreds of tons, for 20 miles?
And the mental image everyone has is, people rolling logs under the stone, the roller hypothesis. It's been dominant for 400 years.
And here's the really fascinating part from the sources. That theory didn't come from prehistory. It came from 1586, Renaissance Rome.
Yeah. The architect Domenico Fontana successfully moved a 327-ton Egyptian obelisk. That operation was the birth of the roller theory. He used sledges on wooden rollers, but, and this is the key part, he moved it along a short, flat, prepared track of rammed earth.
And then that specific success was just projected backwards onto every prehistoric site.
By antiquarians, yeah. And the reason was always framed through this modern lens of efficiency. They said it required fewer people.
But the 20th century experiments proved that was deeply flawed.
Totally flawed, at least for prehistoric conditions. People trying to move Moai replicas or bluestone replicas found that rollers are incredibly unstable on uneven ground.
So they were just wobbly and dangerous.
Exactly. They caused the sledges to slew and spin, and if the rollers had even slightly different circumferences, the whole thing would jam.
So if rollers fail on uneven ground, what do they actually use?
Well, ethnographically documented methods suggest a far more reliable way to do it. Timber sledges hauled over static transverse logs, basically slipways or sleepers.
So the logs don't roll, they're fixed.
Right. They're set firmly in the ground to provide a solid, prepared track for the sledge to slide over. It stops the sledge from digging into soft ground, and it keeps everything stable. It works perfectly on long, uneven paths.
That's a huge distinction. It flips the whole theory from rolling to sliding.
It does, and this brings us back to the why. The idea that saving labor was the ancient priority. That's really a modern, ethnocentric trope.
Oh, because we just assume efficiency is always the goal.
Precisely. The sources cite examples like the Sumba culture in Indonesia, where maximizing the number of people in a hall was a competitive display. It showed off wealth, status.
So the goal wasn't just getting the stone from A to B.
Sometimes the meaning was in the making. The effort itself was the point.
So what does this all mean? I mean, whether we're looking at natural monoliths like Uluru or man-made megaliths like Stonehenge, these structures force us to confront two things: the immense scale of geology and engineering, and the really profound worldview of the ancient mind.
And that fascination hasn't left us. You just have to think about that viral thing with the reflective monoliths that were appearing in Utah and Romania back in 2020.
Right.
Even today, a sudden, inexplicable monument makes us project these vast theories onto it. Artists, marketing stunts, even aliens. The need to find meaning in that kind of simplicity is still with us.
But if we go back to the Neolithic origins, the core mystery is still there. It's not just how they spread so fast or even how they moved the stones with slipways. It's what motivated them, what motivated these early societies who were just emerging from what we call a primitive lifestyle to undertake such massive coordinated efforts in the first place.
That unresolved question about the motivation behind the oldest and most widespread construction culture in human history, that remains the most profound challenge for future research. And maybe for your own exploration.